Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 63 of Podcast vs. Enemies, a Destiny Massive Breakdowns show. We have a very special, exciting episode today, and if you do not follow us on social media, you are going to be in for a treat, as we are joined by Bungies' Chris Proctor, the Senior Design Lead and Weapons Feature Lead for Destiny 2, and Rodney Thompson, Senior Design Lead and Armor and Buildcrafting Design Lead. We're really excited to welcome them on the show, but before we do that, let's get to our usual thank yous and a brief show intro and outline. Saint, hello sir, how are you? Who are we thanking this week?
I'm going to give a quick shout out to all of our sponsors that support us via Patreon in a huge way. And first of all, a new sponsor. I'm Kay Rose. Really hope I am not mispronouncing your name. Looking forward to seeing you in the Discord, playing with you soon. As always, want to shout out a Modern Viking, Askian Monk, Bryce Aroni, Deacon, Moonlight, Shazzle, Sylv, and This Moment. We're not going to go into our usual spill here. We're just going to get right into the episode. Remember to check out Massive Breakdowns with Lego and Ill Physics, Edmonton Sons with Kit and Merc. Court, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, so this is our big special Bungie developer Q&A interview. So just a little kind of show outline here, just to give it a little bit of a perspective. I know last time we had Chris and Vivian on, there was a little bit of confusion as to like what we could discuss, what we could ask. So this is just a quick outline before we head over to the actual the meat and potatoes of the episode. So it's 90 minutes here. First section, we're going to be interviewing Chris Proctor and Rodney Thompson, featuring the Season 21 PvE focused discussion about the updates to exotic weapons, archetypes, perks, and reticles, and last week's exotic armor reworks. And then we'll follow up with another section which goes into our own personal host Q&A and some community questions as well. We have collected some questions primarily from the Destiny Massive Breakdowns patrons and sponsors, along with picking up some general questions from Twitter and the Destiny Massive Breakdowns Discord server. If you want to, if you're interested in these type of episodes, do sound off that particular feedback to us and Destiny and Bungie themselves. And just for your information, our last Bungie Dev episode was way back in November 2022. We had Chris Proctor and Vivian Bex of the Weapons team. That was episode 38. And just to make it a little bit clear here, as this is a PvE podcast, expect this to be focused on PvE. We do have Mercules and Eric Smith from the Abilities team. They are going to be on the firing range, so check them out for that PvP nitty gritty. Again, if you'd like the opportunity to field questions next time we have Bungie devs on, or our sibling podcast, Destiny Massive Breakdowns, join our Discord and look out for any announcements. The questions were curated to the departments that the devs represent, so Chris Proctor for weapons, for example, perks, origin traits, weapon systems, exotic weapons, and Rodney Thompson for the armor, build crafting, and mods. So for example here, damage stacking, armor charges, exotic armor, and mods. You won't find any questions or answers related to other departments like abilities, combat, raids and dungeons, narrative, general economy, materials, etc. in this episode. If you'd like to hear it from the developers from these and other areas of Destiny, then let Bungie know. Questions were submitted to Bungie for approval. What can and cannot be discussed is up to the discretion of Bungie and Chris and Rodney. When it comes to the approach to the Q&A here, just regarding exotic armor posts from last week, we don't want to make this Q&A session a bullet point list of why was XYZ exotic armor not talked about, just listing off general feedback regarding the announced exotic armor changes. As we personally don't think that makes up for an interesting kind of developer Q&A session, but we do touch on the sort of high levels for exotic armor, and Rodney goes into a little bit more detail as the philosophy and the decision making when it comes to exotic armor. Hopefully that does answer those type of questions. But yeah, of course, sound off your feedback to the armor team and Bungie themselves if you've got those particular kind of questions when it comes to those. We also ask our community to vary their questions as much as possible, focusing on things we've not really heard from recently, mixed in with some high-level and more technical questions. We'll, of course, have a show transcription and an overview breakdown over on Reddit. Those links can be viewed on the show notes for the episode, and we'll also have a link towards the Reddit breakdown. All right, please welcome our two special guests to the show. It's Chris Proctor and Rodney Thompson. Let's start off with some intros. Chris is a returning guest to the show and has been on Destiny Massive Breakdowns and multiple other Destiny podcasts over the last few years. For the benefit of those who are brand new to Destiny or this podcast, what do you do at Bungie?
Hey folks, I am a senior design lead at Bungie and the feature lead for the weapons team. So I do team leadership stuff and also a bunch of weapons content.
So what exotics and weapons have you been working on recently for Lightfall?
Yeah, I actually didn't work on any exotics for Lightfall. I was mostly working on Season 21 stuff.
Okay.
I did the raid weapons and a bit of work on the raid exotic. And otherwise I did one of the exotics for Season 21 and a bunch of other bits and pieces. All the radical stuff as well, I guess.
What kind of highlights have you been working on the last couple of seasons? Like, say, up to Lightfall?
Season 19 was a lot of fun. Like, getting to do the Tex Mechanica set, and all of the, like, tons of Foundry weapons and all that kind of thing. Otherwise, all of the radical work has been a ton of fun to work on. Cool.
We'll be talking about that later on in the podcast. Impetus, you want to introduce Rodney?
Oh, I'd love to. I believe, sir, that this is your very first appearance on a community podcast, but I could be wrong. We have recently seen you discussing some Lightfall changes on news articles and in the Lightfall Vidoc, along with some TWAB appearances. So kind of as a general introduction here, Rodney, how did you get started in games, and what have you been up to at Bungie?
Yeah, so I started in games way back in the dark ages of 2001 when I was actually still in college. Started out doing freelance tabletop game design for a bunch of different tabletop RPG companies. And then I did that for a few years. I got hired by one of those companies to run an RPG product line, moved to the Seattle area, and once I got out here, I worked on RPGs and board games and card games and things like that for a while. So after about 15 years in tabletop games, I decided that I needed to broaden my horizons and applied for that job at Bungie with zero expectations of getting it. And then like 4 months later, found myself working at Bungie. I've been at Bungie for 8 years now, and started out as an activity designer on D2. I did a lot of the design of the open world stuff on EDZ, so like the adventures and quests and things like that used to be in the game. And then I was on the engineering team for a couple of years, and then moved over to sandbox design, and I've been a sandbox designer for about the last 5-ish years. And in that time, I was for a while feature lead of the armor team, and now I am the sandbox design lead for the rewards area, which is the fancy way of saying that I am Chris's boss. But not just that. Also, I oversee both the weapons and armor team, the rewards UI team, and basically am responsible for making sure that we're putting out the best sort of sandbox rewards content that we can. And that encompasses everything from, the mechanics to art to UI, etc.
So just a few things. Okay.
Yeah, I was gonna say, hey, tabletop RGBs, FPS RPGs, it's all 6 stats, right? Like, I feel like there's so much of that stuff that just carries over between no matter what.
I mean, the funny thing is, when I came to Bungie, one of my biggest fears, obviously, was like, am I going to be able to do this? Have they made a huge mistake in hiring me? And one of the things I learned very on is that while like the specific implementation of game design is different, a lot of the underlying philosophies are the same, and a lot of the times what you're trying to do is, produce a particular player experience. And a lot of what changes is actually just the speed and the tools at your disposal. So like if I'm working on a tabletop game, I don't have audio or controller rumble or anything like that. So I have to communicate things in other ways, like through art or through evocative text or through board game components, like, the little meeple looks like a fish or something, right? But, when I work on video games, I do have all those tools at my disposal, but everything moves a lot faster. There's physics and there's, a lot of things like that involved. So it's similar the underlyings are similar enough that I was able to make the transition, but the details are obviously quite far apart.
This is going to be true for everyone that works on a live service game, but your area of expertise, as large as that is, has seen a pretty hefty transformation in the past few seasons. There's been a lot of changes made to rewards, broadly speaking. How are you handling all those changes? I have to imagine those were probably thought out well in advance, but now that we're kind of going through the motions of actually putting out all of these new acquisition methods, these new economy changes that are coming both with the release of Lightfall, but also with the start of the next season, season 21. How are things feeling? You feel like you're still flying by the seat of your pants? Are you very excited with how things are landing?
It's one of those things where if I didn't have, an all-star team of people that I worked with every day, and I didn't have, feature leads like Chris or the other ones that are really strong designers in their own right, it would be a lot more difficult. But the nice part is I can, I often feel like when I walk in the building virtually these days, I'm like, well, here I am, the worst player on the all-star team, right? Everyone else is very everyone else is very talented. Everyone's at the top of their game. So, in some ways, a lot of the pain points and details kind of fall away, and I get to really focus on bigger picture stuff. At the same time, I also feel compelled to get my hands dirty. So I end up doing a lot of IC work myself. I mean, I think Chris and I are similar in this regard. In that we both enjoy actually making things that players will put their hands on, right? So I get to kind of do a little bit of both. As far as how it's been with the changes coming in, we did work on them for a long time. I was saying before we started recording that I started working on the build crafting revamps in Lightfall in the summer of 2021. Right. And, just paper design back then. But way back then was when we started working on it. And through months of, design work and play testing and redesign and play testing and redesign and play testing, right? Everything went through a lot of iterations. And then when Lightfall launched and players finally got their hands on it, there's always that sort of holding your breath moment where you're like, are people going to like this thing? And initial reactions are one thing, and then I had some things that I knew I was like, okay, on day one I'm going to hear a lot of complaints about this, but by day 7 everyone's going to have adapted to it, and there's always that newness factor that's like, this is different, so therefore it is bad because now I don't know how anything works. But then people develop some mastery over it, right? And they start figuring out oh, here are the ins and outs of the new thing. And then, you start seeing the conversation get a lot more nuanced and textured. So once we got over that initial shock of the new stuff coming out, the conversation got a lot more what I would expect out of, something like build crafting, which is very nuanced and very detail oriented.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just gonna, this is kind of a funny one, but I think that Rodney knows this. The first time I ever saw the build crafting system, nobody told us anything. They just gave us a build and they were like, here you go. You got 2 hours, come back. And I had, I don't want to say a negative reaction, but it was just shocking, right? When you're so used to something over so many years to that exact point and you're trying to change things so dramatically. And I think what changed in my mind for me to see it as the future, right? And to really believe in this was seeing it as a complete platform change, right? It's you're rebuilding the foundation for everything that you want to do. And yeah, I don't. It's funny to hear you describe that because I remember very vividly going through the stages of like shock, grief, rejection, denial, acceptance. Yeah, it's a tough few days.
And we saw that with our own designers, right? Like in playtests when we would introduce, okay, it's first playtest of this big new change or whatever. The feedback would always come back with like, oh my, what are we doing here? Blah blah blah. There was always a lot of, even with designers, let's say concern, right? That after playtest number 3 or 5 or whatever would eventually start to change and be more focused on like, okay, here are the, ways that we can improve this or tinker with this, as opposed to just that initial shock. And I think a lot of it just comes down to, whenever you have something that really changes the rules that you have mastered, it can be difficult to, accept it for what it is, because what it's actually saying is, no, we have nullified your mastery in some ways, right? Now, obviously that's an extreme description of what happens there, right? But in some ways we're sort of saying, okay, you've spent time mastering this thing. I'm asking you to spend some more time to remaster it. And so, yeah, it's a completely understandable reaction that even, seasoned veteran game designers experience when we playtest for the first time. And like, I don't just mean like, oh, someone else put the hands on the controller for this thing I've been working on. I mean, the first time I pick up the controller, I'm like, oh, what have I done? Right.
So I guess kind of follow up on our, topics here. How are you feeling? We're almost this full season out from build crafting relaunch. Dust is settled. What do you think?
Feeling largely positive about it. For the most part, I mean, there were some features that before it even came out, I was like, okay, this thing is going to succeed, right? Like the loadout system and the mod manager system, right? I was like, these are great additions to the game that are going to be big hits. And like, obviously anything can be improved. So there's still plenty of space for things to get improved there. But it's been generally about what I expected. So in some ways it's like, it's very relieving because it's like, oh, okay, like I knew this was going to happen. I would say I am always on the lookout for ways to tinker with my own designs or the designs that my teams are working on, right? So perpetual tinkerer here, right? Can never be truly satisfied with the thing that you have made. But we've seen an uptick in people transitioning from being a new player to being someone who uses mods to create builds. There were a lot of moving parts with the changes that we made, including things on the activity and difficulty side. So as we've continued to refine those and as continue to look forward to future seasons, I feel like I've grown a lot more confident that we have landed in a good place and can, iterate from here. Right. And, honestly, like what has been encouraging to me is that I see conversations, not just from, the high level streamers, but all the way down to, like my friends on our Discord. I have a Discord that's all my friends that play Destiny. Right. And my friends that previously were like, I don't care at all about build crafting. Now they're like, hey, I put together this build. Can you help me find the right blah, blah, blah to go with it? Like that's been the encouraging part for me, is like still seeing the big, YouTube videos about builds, but also like people who had previously been reluctant to engage in the build crafting side of the game have since started to sink their teeth into it.
So I want to poke back at something that you said earlier about always wanting to fiddle with your own designs. It's one of the really nice things about working on a live game is that you can do that.
Right.
Like before this, I was all working on AAA box products. Like I worked on Halo Infinite for 4 years, and I have Halo 5 and stuff. Doing mostly anime AI design and things, and you have to get everything right. Like you take a long time to get there, but you only get one shot at it. Whereas we can fairly frequently ship a sort of simplified version of a thing and then layer onto it after it ships, which, lets us get into a good place much more efficiently, I think.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. So I got one last one for you here, Rodney, before we continue on.
Sure.
Somebody told me I need to ask you about your Star Wars miniatures collection. What's going on there?
Well, this will be no good to those listening to the podcast, but if you look in the background of my video, you can see that I have a couple of cases in the background, IKEA shelves of Star Wars Armada minis. I'm just like, I got my start in professional game design working on Star Wars, and I have continued to enjoy playing Star Wars games ever since then. And so in addition to these two big IKEA shelves of Armada minis, there's four giant, basically like dressers of Star Wars, the Star Wars miniatures game minis in a closet, making my wife angry in the background. And then, I don't know, man. I'm a hoarder.
You might need to send us a little picture of that because one of our sibling podcasts might be very interested in in all that.
Oh boy, yeah.
I have Mercules and Kit do a Star Wars podcast. I don't know if you knew about that. Actually,
I did not know that. Really?
Yeah, Beneath
Yeah,
Twin
definitely.
Suns. Okay,
Oh.
just a little plug there for you. Yeah.
I'm gonna look that one up.
All right. We're going to head over to our next section here where it's the sort of meat and potatoes. So we were given a sneak peek ahead of this week's Wednesday blog post that's posting May 17th, detailing a bunch of changes coming in Season 21. Chris mentioned at the top of this episode weapon reticles, but there's also some information related to charge meters, full auto melee, and some exotic weapon tuning. So we'll be asking Chris some questions on these changes, and then we'll rewind a week and ask Rodney with the sort of exotic armor blog post from last week. So Chris, some very interesting changes there. I've got some questions related to the reticles. So how long has this been in the pipeline? How long has this system been in the pipeline? And sort of give us a rundown on how the game engine has facilitated these changes.
So we started on these reticle changes back in Season 19 when we shipped the fixed palette spread stuff. We looked at what we could currently do with reticles and what we were blocked on because we didn't quite have the tech for it. So we shipped those. And then we realized that we needed to have the ability to scale reticles more cleanly based on field of view so that we could have the shotgun reticle size match the pellet spread. And then while we were in there, we figured, well, there's a lot of other information that we could convey via reticles. And in the past, this has just been hard-coded, like there's that glaive energy meter, right? That's not something that you can just use for any old thing. It's specific to glaive energy. So we got the ability to basically put anything we want from weapons into a reticle through something that we call channels. And that includes stuff like like a fusion rifle charge state, or like a sword melee energy, exotic perk counters, like basically anything that any aspect of a weapon we can put into a reticle in some form. So yeah, that's all been coming since Season 19, and we got the bulk of the stuff that we needed for it in time for Season 21.
I did speak to you recently regarding some of these reticle changes because we got some videos a few weeks back in one of the TWABs. My sort of comment here is related to is this intended to sort of offload a little bit of the bloat or the stress from the bottom left status buff debuff UI? And is this going to be sort of a running theme for weapons in particular? And will the buff and debuff UI still show weapon elements? So, for example, Memento Mori is getting a perk counter for its pips, but will the buff and debuff UI still feature that?
So I think any case where a weapon's perks, like an exotic weapon's perk status, is important to being able to use the weapon, we want to have that information in the reticle. So like perk active or perk counters or build up to being able to activate a thing, like that should always be in the reticle. It can't only be in the reticle because currently those are only in hipfire, not aim down sights. And we would rather have multiple locations where we show that information anyway. But I think it will let us reduce the priority of some of these. Like if you can see the damage shader for Memento Mori and the perk counter in the reticle, maybe it's okay if Memento Mori buff text falls off the bottom. We're generally aware of how overcrowded that buff area gets, and there's some tweaks, like some pretty big adjustments coming to that in like several seasons down the line. And some of the stuff that we're doing now will let us make better use of that.
Yeah, I think you kind of just answered my next question that I was going to ask here. Just following up on the idea that this is a really nice way to like communicate in a very succinct way. I know, like Rodney, you were talking just a second ago about like how much more space you have to like communicate to the player, right? In the FPS versus tabletop type of scenario. It seems like there are plans to maybe distribute some more of this buff, debuff information like this in the future. I know you mentioned this as well, but kind of long lamented few lines of text there, buff debuff screen in the bottom left. Anything specific there, or just kind of we'll wait and see that one out over the next few seasons?
It's way too early to drop any specifics. I just know that we are working on it.
All right, moving over to sniper rifles. Now, they have been a bit of a rough spot in PvE. I absolutely acknowledge their power fantasy if they were to get a much larger damage buff. So shout out to Destiny 1 days, because I played them and I absolutely abused the sniper rifles in those particular environments. So in your eyes, does on top of the Season 20's Rapid Fire Reserves buff and the upcoming sniper rifle damage buff close out the gap sufficiently to make snipers a more appetizing choice?
It'd be pretty easy to overdo damage on sniper rifles. This is one of those cases where we're dialing it up a bit at a time rather than like giving them a 20% damage buff like we did to LFRs, but they were way behind, right? Like sniper rifles are not that far off from their special ammo. We think that the rapid fire sniper buff is a pretty solid change for that specific subfamily, like it was about 30% extra reserves or something. So we definitely want to wait and see how that lands before we push any further on it. For certain weapons, for certain snipers, 10% is actually a pretty decent chunk. A lot of it also depends on the encounter distances for whatever the current content is. Like if we have a new raid which has a really easily sniped boss, then we'd see sniper rifles come up. And so like if we're dealing with mostly mid and short range encounters, we don't want to mess with something that players aren't actually using at the moment, because it'll be hard to evaluate.
What other buffs could you apply to snipers that doesn't affect their damage? And this could be specifically to sniper families as well, but still uplifts them if this still isn't enough. If, say, a damage buff isn't enough.
I mean, the major ones are like a damage or ease of use or uptime. So we've done a bit of a damage one here. We did the uptime one on rapid fires by increasing their reserves. I could see doing another recoil reduction, maybe. So we did that just to rapid fires, because they were pretty hard to control. But I think more likely we just bump the damage up a little bit more if it's still not quite there. So I think it is, given the range, it's important that they be relatively hard to use at distance. Like you don't want to eliminate all of the recoil and flinch and stuff, because then you can very safely ping from a distance and the damage almost doesn't matter. I'd rather bump up the damage a bit more and make them a little harder to use.
So in the blog post here, you did specifically mention this applies to the exotic snipers, with the exception of Izanagi's Burden's charge shot. So it wouldn't make sense to gloss over one of the community's biggest feedback points, which is related to Whisper and Darcy. You've said a few podcasts ago that the weapons team will still continue to work on them to get the right fantasy as heavy snipers. Is this still the case? And how are they performing? And is there any plans for their own tuning?
Yeah, so Whisper and Darcy aren't being used a whole lot, and they're probably a little under where we want them to be. Whisper in particular is pretty close, though. We think that the 10% buff now puts that, like for DPS, it puts them above linear fusions, or puts Whisper above linear fusions. We're actually like looking at a longer term, larger change to Whisper. That's several seasons away, but it's still on our radar. And we think it'll perform pretty well in season 21. For Darcy, that's currently much weaker than we want it to be, but it is a rapid fire sniper rifle, so it's getting that like recoil reduction and the massively increased reserves. So we want to see how that lands before we make any further adjustments to it. Just because people keep asking about making it special ammo, like I We don't think that would really solve the problem because there's already a lot of special ammo snipers. Like, would you really want Darcy to try to compete with Cloud Strike, for example, when they're both rapid fires, they're both arc? It's not quite as simple as just moving it. So we're going to continue to try to make a heavy ammo roll for it.
Very cool.
All right, finally from me anyway, for when it comes to something I wanted to kind of highlight. The big highlight here was the Tyranny of Heaven comment, basically confirming Last Wish as the next raid with a refresh perk pool. So these raids drop with the older 3x3 perk layout. So columns 3 and 4 had 3 perks each. Can we expect them to get the 7x7 treatment like the newer raids? And have you got any sneak peeks?
I mean, the Tyranny of Heaven change doesn't necessarily mean anything. I'm sure you're all just reading into it. But when we do reprised raid weapons, we typically bring them in line with whatever the standard is. And for reprised raid weapons that are craftable, it would be 7 perks per column. Yeah. What's the other part of that? Oh, yeah. So it's worth noting that whenever we do old raid weapons, if they had like particularly strong perk combinations on them, we almost always bring those back intact. So if you had a Rampage, Kill Clip, whatever, the new version will get that. Like, it's okay for raid weapons to break the rules a little bit. As far as things to watch out for, there's that new rocket launcher perk coming. It's called Bipod. So you should watch out for that on a few weapons. Maybe a raid one.
Mm-hmm. Bipod,
Interesting.
huh? All right. Okay.
No, I think just to sort of highlight your point there, Deepstone Crypt was obviously the most recent refreshed perk pool, and we were gushing on it on several episodes ago. Some really juicers, some big hitters, which I think shout out to Commemoration as one of the best void machine guns right now, especially in this sandbox, in Season 2020 sandbox. It's been tear away.
Arguably weapon of the season, right? Maybe conditional finality. I don't know. Yeah, that's how.
What specifically was it on Commemoration? Like, what makes it that good?
Well, I don't know. Court, what do you use?
So I currently have, let's see, it's somewhere. So
I'm going to say mine was Killing Tally and Reconstruction.
Yeah, Killing Tally and Reconstruction. Really solid combo. Subsistence as well as like a backup if you want that. But I think, yeah, Bray Inheritance as well. And then, yeah, of course, it helps with this season being all about void and volatile flow, causing all the volatile explosions everywhere. But I think I'll still be using Commemoration post season 21.
Yeah, Impetus, what do you use? Same?
Well, thank you for calling me out, Saint. I'm currently sitting at 0 out of 5 red borders for Commemoration, so... that's fine, dude. Thanks.
Hey, we always got corrective measure, right?
Retrofit Excavate, close enough, right?
Okay, yeah. Still good.
I need to do the Tanics checkpoint and get those knocked out, yeah.
Well, yeah. Chain of Command does have osmosis.
Thank you, yes, thank you.
And to be honest, all those Deepstone Crypt weapons are just big highlights. Commemoration is just the bigger of the highlights, but some really juicers.
Yeah,
reprising like endgame weapons like this is a real opportunity to look at how we shipped them initially and improve them where we felt like we missed the market originally.
I mean, he got me to use a 180 hand cannon in PvE, which doesn't really happen usually. So that's definitely a bar to set there. Speaking of machine guns, though, I want to kind of pivot here and just talk about some of the weapons that were mentioned here. Sweet Business is getting a buff. It is getting an explosive round. Is this kind of our traditional explosive payload? Is this something else?
So player facing it will look a bit like explosive payload in that every so often a little explosion will play on the target. But unlike explosive payload, it's additional damage. It doesn't split the damage of the bullet, and it does a higher percentage of the damage and in a larger radius. So it's sort of like explosive payload, but stronger and not every single bullet.
Sold. I'll tell you what. I'm excited for that one. Another one is the Legend of Aqueous change. Legend of Aqueous, since it's kind of trench barrel buff, it's seen a few buffs over the past year or so. it has, already some pretty obscene damage output potential, and it's getting about a 33% buff to its ammo economy and its outright range, which, you could say it's its biggest weakness. Where do you guys see Aqueous kind of fitting into like the DPS economy, maybe compared to some other options like exotic swords or just swords in general?
Yeah, it does a giant pile of damage per shot. It's pretty good in close range boss fights. It's also very, very good against champions, even more so when shotguns are featured in the artifact. So, not a coincidence this is shipping in this season. It's still kind of a niche pick, but this definitely helps it with viability. Of course, the point with swords, we are reworking swords in a future release, which is going to shake up close range stuff quite a bit. But for Season 21, I expect Aqueous to be a pretty strong option.
Very cool. Slight follow-up on that one. Is that going to work with the no backup plans? Roddy, maybe you need to weigh in on this one that we're going to talk about in just a second there, which is getting a big rework.
It currently works with no backup plans. It is just a shotgun, a really big shotgun. But yeah, maybe Rodney can comment on the armor tie-in.
As far as I know, yes.
Man, how about that? That sounds like a lot of fun waiting to happen. I'm also, I've said this a bunch on the show before, but I'm like huge offensive bulwark junkie. So the changes to no backup plans are really have me enticed. A couple more hits on the weapons article though. Salvation's grip is getting a massive rework. I believe this is our very first stasis weapon in the game, and it kind of was just like this quest gun. People would meme about it a lot, and now it's getting some pretty big damage dealing potential. Kind of reminiscent of the Verglas curve. Is this something that you guys have been wanting to touch for a while, or something that was kind of inspired by that?
Yeah, I've been wanting to touch Salvation's grip for ages. It was just firstly, hard to come up with a new design for it that worked with the exotic fantasy and worked in the heavy slot, and that we had time to do. So it's a fairly complex exotic. And yeah, coincidentally, the same designer as did Verglas Curve decided to take a crack at it. So it's not a coincidence that those two have some similarities.
Very cool. Very cool. Lastly, we see a bit of a mention of reconstruction here, and reconstruction is kind of being reworked a little bit to be maybe standardized. Any hints on where we might see reconstruction appear next on a weapon archetype or something like that?
Oh yeah, it's on quite a few weapons actually. It's rolling out across more endgame weapons for the most part. But yeah, if you have the opportunity, you should definitely pick up a rocket launcher with reconstruction bipod, because that is ridiculous.
Okay. All right. A good tip maybe for the Nightfall next season. I'll be on the lookout for that.
I will say I am looking forward to the Grabton Lance change, where it's kind of getting the similar Revision Zero kind of treatment. Just wanted to give that a shout out because it is one of my top tier exotic weapons.
Nice, yeah, I'll pass that on to Merc. He was the designer on Revision Zero and also did this adjustment to Graviton Lance, so that's also no coincidence.
I did look at it like, that seems like Merc's work, because Revision Zero obviously being his little baby, so yeah.
It's so much fun, particularly in PvP, where you remember year one meta, it was all over the place. And
yes.
I think Graviton Lance is still my top Crucible weapons of all time for that exact reason. And Revision Zero, what an absolute just glow up that weapon has seen with its recent buff. That was awesome to see. Okay, Cord, Impetus, you guys got any other questions before we jump into our armor post here and all that stuff?
No, let's jump into armor.
All right. I mean, we kind of try to represent all our classes here. Personally, as the Titan main, seeing Eternal Warrior get buffed up and just completely redone was absolute treat. Kind of, even though it may have kind of come at the cost of some absurd burning steps damage buffs, really happy to see that one getting reworked. Is that something that's kind of been in the background for a while, or were there other options for Eternal Warrior or anything like that?
We tried a few different things, but what actually ended up happening was around the same time I was, we were, sorry, let me try that again. Around the time that we were deciding which of our exotics we wanted to tackle, right? We also were looking at places where we'd introduce new systems into the game that we might not have retrofitted into all of our existing exotics, right? And so when you look at like Path of the Burning Steps and changing to use the same damage bonuses as the Surge mods, that was a case where, we've been trying to make a concerted effort to unify a lot of our damage bonuses and relieve some of the pressure that people were feeling to like, okay, well, I have to maximize my damage by stacking up every single thing I possibly can, right? And it so happened that in the process of doing that, we looked at, the way it was shaking out in Path of Burning Steps, and it kind of clicked like, hey, maybe the Arc version of this is what we need for Eternal Warrior, right? And sort of looking at it and saying like, okay, what this does is it gives you a nice sort of neutral mini game. You want to keep the kills rolling. It works with, weapons and abilities. So it's not just one or the other. You just want to keep the matching damage type kills rolling. And then when you do something or when something happens, you jump up to the highest buff, and it's a higher buff than you can get from the surge mods on your legs. Right. And so for, Path, that was a defensive thing, like you becoming slow to encased. And then for Eternal Warrior, it's like, okay, you use your super. When it ends, you get to keep the train rolling by it kicking into the tier 4 buff, right? So it's sort of a case of, we had two different things we were working on at the same time, and it was like, oh, okay, the solve for this one actually might also be the solve for this one over here. So yeah, that's how that came to be.
Very cool. Very cool. Another one, I know I'm just talking about Home of the Titan main. This is Impetus' territory over here, but Chromatic Fire is getting a awesome rework where it has the ability to dip into like every elemental sandbox, and that is I'm really excited to try that one out. It has so much utility now. Is there any chance we see something like that work its way into other armor pieces, a la a Bombardiers or, any kind of Titan exotic or anything like that? Or is that kind of a unique, it's for warlocks, they get their special chest piece?
Yeah, so it's definitely not just for warlocks. And I think, examples like Bombardiers are a great thing that, we want to look at to get a, if not a similar treatment, then at least find more places where we can unify the mechanics with things we've already got, right? Don't have anything specific to talk about with Bombardiers off the top of my head, but that's certainly I would say that's certainly our intent, is to make it so that when things seem like they should work together, provided that it's not completely busted, they do, right? However, something like Chromatic Fire is, it's, I don't want to call it an exceptional case, but it's something we certainly want to be judicious with, because anytime we have these exotics like Bombardiers or Chromatic Fire, that it's like, okay, it's different effect based on your subclass, right? That is a pretty high amount of design work and test work to make that happen. And it also can end up being a pretty impactful thing on like system memory and latency and things like that, just because there's a lot of different checks and moving parts that have to take place in order to say like, okay, I'm on this subclass, therefore this is the effect that's created, etc. Right. And then just from the design standpoint, we often want to make sure that like, if we're doing one of these things where it changes functionality based on the subclass, that it is still simple enough to use that you feel like you can understand it no matter what subclass you're playing. So something that would like radically change the, activation or something like that, we wouldn't want to spread that across all subclasses. But something like Chromatic Fire, where it's get a precision kill, like, okay, well, that's a pretty straightforward trigger. And then the effects are the kinds of effects that we see in detonations for those different damage types all the time. So it's a little bit more comprehensible no matter what subclass you're on. Bombardier is sort of the same deal, right? Like, what do you need to do? Well, you need to dodge, right? So the door is open to that, but it's always sort of a decision point of it's like, okay, do we want this to be something that is broadly applicable across multiple subclasses and has differing effects, or do we want to pick one of those and really embrace that one subclass or that one damage type and really build a more elaborate exotic around it, right? It's just there's no one is right and one is wrong. It's just what's right for the particular exotic that we're going to be working on.
Good to hear. Good to hear. It's a bit of an easier one here. So a lot of exotics getting updated here is a huge sweeping list. The only one that came to my mind that I think is still just like kind of lagging behind the, you know, the skills or the traits or the utility that some of these are offering is Mask of the Quiet One on the Titan. Any chance we see a Mask of the Quiet One buff in the next few seasons?
It's certainly on the list of things that we are looking at. And I say it's on the list of things because there is a list, right? And it is a list that is constantly changing. We use usage data as a great way to know, like, okay, what's getting used a lot. We use usage data by ownership, like what's being used among the general populace, what's being used among people that own it. We look at usage across activities. So, not just activity types like PvP and PvE, but also difficulty, so GMs, etc. We look at success rate, right? So like we can tell what exotic you're wearing when your team wipes in a GM Nightfall, right? And so like we can look at success percentages and things like that. And so a lot of what we're doing is, looking at usage data across a really broad spectrum, and anything that falls down in like the lower usage percentages across the board, or has like high usage but low success rate, or super high usage by an individual subclass damage type or something like that, like those start to become outliers that filter their way to the top of our priority list. And like you could arguably say like every exotic we have is on our list, right? Because we're constantly reevaluating them. But we tend to bump things up the priority list, and then when it comes time to make the decision of what are we going to touch, a lot of that actually is a combination of like what's high on our priority list, and we consider things like, is something currently unpleasant to play against in PvP, or unpleasant to have someone on your fire team in PvE using, right? And so that kind of, it doesn't necessarily bump it up the usage priority list, but it does make it something we might want to touch sooner. Then there's also the consideration of like, how easy is the change we want to make to it, right? Because if it's a light touch that can make a big impact, we might grab something that is lower down our priority list, but pull it up because, hey, I can add this in, so I can do two of those, or one something that's higher priority. So there's a lot of factors that go into it. And like you call it Mask of the Quiet One. I also have my backlog of ones that I personally want to continue to see improved. Right? It's just a matter of the combination of what's a priority, what do we have time for, and then also like, what do we have a good idea for? Because in some cases, especially like when we're talking about like a wholesale rework, a lot of times you might look at it and you say like, okay, we need to really rework this one, but we've got to make sure that, the rework is successful. It does good things for our game. It also needs to have some tie to the existing fantasy for that exotic. Because I don't think what we want to do is completely change the exotic in such a way that it is not only mechanically different but also thematically different, right? So I there's a lot of different factors that go into it. So that's a really like 3-minute long way of saying maybe.
So I got a quick one. It was Kefri's Scorching.
Mm-hmm.
Any idea? Any chance you know the scorch stacks off the top of your head?
Off the top of my head, no. I could look it up, but it's probably. I think I did about the same as if you get the bonus stacks from Caliban's Hand on Hunter. So I'm trying to remember how much that is, but I can't. So it's pretty comparable to that. I will say, just to stem any initial concerns, that as the wave goes out and comes back, it will only give you those scorch stacks once. So if it hits a target on the way out or on the way back, either one can apply the scorch stacks, but you're not going to get out and back getting you twice as many.
Okay.
Caliban's is 60. 60.
I think that's about right.
50 or 60. That's a good chunk, you know? Yeah, you throw a grenade in there, we got an ignition. All right.
Now, I will say this. I also don't have my remote desktop up in front of me right now, so I might be completely wrong. And it's been, 4 months since I touched that. So
that's fair. That's fair. We won't hold you to the scorched axe on that one. All right. No worries there. No worries there. Last question I've got here. When you have something like Starfire that has just dominated the meta for, a season, a few seasons, how much kind of theory crafting you guys get into in anticipation of the meta, any kind of like fears of where things are going to be shifted whenever, something like Starfire's, I think you described it as sucking the air out of the room for Warlock builds, which I feel is a pretty apt, descriptor. How are you guys kind of anticipating the future meta or fearing the future meta or anything like that whenever something that has been so high in the meta is finally, nerfed, changed, reworked, whatever the case may be?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have entire playtests that their entire purpose is build crafting, right? And we sit down for an hour and a half, and the first hour of it is just making the build, and then we play and the feedback, etc. Right? So it's certainly something that we're always actively looking at. And when it comes to like how does an exotic rework shift the meta, certainly that is a consideration in those playtests and in our discussions. A lot of times we'll also, in the process of doing a rework or doing a nerf, will really specifically target existing player behaviors and say, hey, after the rework, how close can you get to that existing behavior, right? So Starfire is a good example of like when we were playtesting it and tuning the numbers and, doing the design work and everything, we did these playtests where we would load into the checkpoint for Keitel in Duality, right? We say like, okay, you're going to, for this run, let's, do 0 build crafting, but throw on Starfire and see what your damage numbers look like. Okay, we did that. All right, next one, do a small amount of build crafting, just aspects and fragments. Okay, great, did that. Now go as hard as you possibly can, right? Like pretend that you are, carrying your entire dungeon group that everyone else is terrible, and if you don't have the maximum damage, you're gonna wipe here, right? And so we test that, and we do that across multiple play tests, across multiple iterations. And so we're looking at not only how is this going to shift like the what's hot and what's not, but also like how close can you get to what you're doing in the live game today with more build crafting or with different behaviors or what have you. And so like our decisions are kind of informed by with that kind of play testing. And then in some cases, Heart of Endless Light's a great example, right? Like we make a change and we look at it and we're like, yeah, this is probably not going to like obliterate usage, and that's fine. We just don't want it to necessarily be as automatic of a choice as it is right now, right? So we want if you like it and you want to keep using it, like, okay, great, that's fine. But we also want to make it so that you might consider something else at the same time. Starfire, kind of the same deal, where it's like, okay, your neutral game, and we'll see how this actually plays out once the changes hit. But like your neutral game is actually going to be really strong because you're going to be getting those kills, you're going to be getting your grenades back. It's just this very specific case of like, all right, well, I've got my demolition rocket launcher, wither horde, and fusion grenades, so I'm throwing grenades and shooting rockets literally as fast as I can press the buttons. Like, yeah, that's going to fall by the wayside. So, we also consider specific use cases, and then use cases like, am I in a 6-person fire team for a raid, a 3-person fire team for a dungeon, a 1-person fire team for solo dungeon play, right? Like those are all data points that we consider during these build crafting playtests.
Well,
thanks for all
when
that.
We had Vivian and Chris on last time, we did give them a pretty obvious question that turned out to be pretty popular with the community. So we're going to turn that over to you now, Rodney. Can you walk us through the process of creating a new piece of exotic armor? We're doing a refresh pass on an older exotic armor. What are the goals? You've already mentioned that the player usage rates do play a part, but generally speaking, how long does a new piece of exotic armor take to make for the team?
I would say, from initial concept to ship is anywhere from like 6 to 9 months. And that's just partly because art has to begin farther in advance than design actually has to start, but design needs to have some idea of what they're going to be doing so that art can make something that will, play into that. We also often try and have a communication layer in exotics that communicates to the other players in the space what that exotic is doing. So, for example, Star Eater scales, the effects on the fins that glow more brightly the more stacks of Feast of Light you have, like that kind of thing. We think about that pretty far in advance, and then art has to do their part starting much earlier because it takes a lot longer for art to be done. And then, design goes through a few months of paper design, which is, a lot of theoretical design and bouncing ideas off of the other teams. So, when nothing is done in a vacuum, and we usually, do something like, okay, we got our first pass paper design. So we're going to put that in front of the weapons team and the abilities team and, the playtest team, et cetera. Right. And then, from there, it goes back to like, okay, we think we have a solid design. Let's implement this technically. One of the things that I think is a little bit different about Bungie compared to some other studios that I've heard is that there's a pretty high level of technical expectation at Bungie, in that designers, the people that are doing the paper design, are also doing the technical implementation. So, our designers have to do the actual in-engine work to make the exotics work. And then we go into, 3 to 4 months of play testing, 2 to 3 months of bug fixing, and there's overlap time here, obviously. So, it's not exactly precise. But that's sort of like the general shape of things. As far as like how the design decision making goes, exotic armor is actually somewhat unique among our sort of big pillars of gameplay, in that, there is no use your exotic armor button, right? It weapons and abilities, they've claimed all the buttons and the triggers, right? So
there should be a use exotic armor button.
Well, that let's travel back in time and have that conversation with the Destiny 1 team. But there's no, like, we don't have any activation button or anything where you can choose to activate it at that exact moment. So we have to ride on top of our other mechanics, like our weapons and our abilities and things like that. So in the first place, a lot of what we're going to be doing when we're designing a new exotic armor piece is we're going to be looking at what different gameplay elements that we can possibly piggyback on top of might have some design space available to them, right? Because, we've done a lot of things that layer on top of, Rift or Dodge or things like that. And so every time we try and go back to that, the design space is just a little bit smaller than it was the last time. So, we look at different things that we can ride on top of. We are occasionally going to experiment with overriding an existing ability. So a good example of this is like Icefall Mantle, which essentially replaces your barricade. So, and that's, sort of a case where you could ask the question like, hey, why isn't Icefall Mantle's effect just a stasis exclusive barricade? That's a great question. Glad you asked. Anyways, so moving on. It could be, but we look at things like that. We look at if there's any particular needs in the game at the moment. Like, hey, we really feel like there needs to be I'll use Path of Burning Steps because we're talking about. We really think there needs to be something in the game that reacts to stasis a little bit, right? And it might not be the reason that this exotic comes into existence, but it's like, oh, okay, there's a thing there. We can start hanging on that, right? And we start looking at things like, are there any particular subclasses that are struggling more than others, or that are strong in PvE but not PvP, or vice versa, right? And so those kind of considerations, are all taken into account when we figure out, like, okay, what do we want to build off of? I will say that generally speaking, it is harder for us to build something that is broad neutral game utility, just because every time you do that, it crowds out a lot of other things that could possibly go into that space. So, you have to be really measured in your use of things that are just like pure all subclass neutral game. It's sort of like we talked about earlier with like Chromatic Fire, right? That Chromatic Fire theoretically could have been 5 different exotics. It's not, because that's not the way we decided to do it, but it theoretically could be. So you have to kind of weigh okay, neutral exotics versus more specific exotics. It's like all this thinking happens before paper design even starts, really, right? And then once paper design starts, a lot of it is about figuring out okay, here's what we're trying to accomplish with this. We've identified this subclass or this ability or this weapon type or whatever that we're going to hang things off of, and we ask questions like, what do we want the player experience to be? How easy do we want this to be? How tightly should this tie into build crafting? How much should the delta when using this be between someone who's done no build crafting and someone who's done a lot of build crafting, right? And that answer can be different per exotic, right? Because sometimes we say no, this needs to work, like gangbusters right out of the gate. Or it's okay, this should be strong, but then you can build craft into 150% effectiveness or something like that, right? So, so that's all happening at the paper design phase. Then once a pretty thorough set of reviews by all of our sandbox teams have gone over those designs, we start the process of actually creating it, and playtesting essentially starts from day one there, because when a designer implements their first pass of an exotic, they are testing it at their desk in test maps. We have PvE test maps, or you can do essentially local PvP if we want to. And then once something is in a stable state where we can basically say, okay, we can put this into the build and it's not going to break things, at that point it goes out to the larger sandbox playtesting groups, which most of our playtesting takes place with all the different teams working together. Occasionally, we have a playtest here and there that is just the weapons team or just the gameplay team, etc. But generally speaking, when we go into a playtest, we say okay, here's the new thing that's ready for testing. Please, put some hands on it. And then for the next X number of months, it's just a constant process of playtesting, looking for what's working and what's not, making sure it's hitting all of our goals and all of our fantasies, and then, shepherding it along until it finally hits the shipping point, and then doing the bug fixing pass there.
Is it fair to say that the paper design phase is where you guys choose to commit to making the specific piece of exotic armor? Because you said that there's a lot of ideation that goes into it. So at what point do you guys say, yeah, I think we've got something here, let's actually start working on this, bringing it to fruition? Sure.
I would say that we, in general, know... once we have said to our artists, hey, we're going to make hunter exotic legs that are generally themed like this, at that point we are making hunter exotic legs. There's no time where it's oh, well, we got 3 months into designing these legs, but we actually should be a headpiece right now. At that point we are making hunter exotic legs, right? As far as the actual mechanics go, there have absolutely been times where during the playtesting process we've discovered hey, we thought this thing was going to work and it just isn't, right? And have to take it back to the drawing board. And we've absolutely done that before. You don't want that to happen though, right? Generally you want to feel like there is a strong enough concept that more than just the designer responsible for that exotic is interested in and excited about, so that by the time it gets implemented, by the time it gets to playtesting, we have a high degree of confidence in it. So I wouldn't say at that point we've committed to it, but we really want it to be, in good enough shape that we can count on that being the thing that we develop. Because another thing that happens is we often have to make requests of other disciplines, like our engineers or our FX artists, And once you have, gotten that person committed to spending some amount of time on the thing that you're going to ship, you want to make sure that request was for something that is going to ship, so that their time and their effort wasn't, for naught, essentially. Right. So, I high confidence at that point that it's going to ship, but it's never 100%.
Well, I've got one more question before we pivot over to the community Q&A here, and it will hopefully not take up the rest of our time, but it will be for both Rodney and Chris here. We'd love to have some clarification on Bungie's philosophy regarding damage stacking, especially post Lightfall. The two articles just both went into depth about buffs, stacking, what doesn't stack, the tier of a buff, what will be provided with certain changes, and I think quite a few people that are really wanting to dig all the way into build crafting, really flesh out a build, want to know how does everything stick together, and what is the idea behind things that should not stick together or are unintentionally sticking together and stacking versus not stacking. So, Rodney, if we can just continue with you, what is the philosophy, especially when it comes to exotic armor and stacking? If you want to start with Path of the Burning Steps as an example, the changes that you made to that exotic armor, what the general philosophy is for the armor team in regards to buffs.
Yeah, I would say that broadly speaking, the more damage bonuses that stack with one another, the faster the arms race is with activity design. But more than that, it also adds a lot of static to build crafting, and not just in like I feel like I got to get every single ounce of damage I can out of my build, but also by crowding out other mods or other perks, you shut off the possibility space that someone could have a really clever creative build there. So I would say, broadly speaking, the proliferation of like damage bonuses that stack with each other is something we want to be wary of, not just for balance reasons, but also just for the sort of what makes the game interesting to play and to build around. Broadly speaking, for armor, the approach we are taking these days is, unless there's a really good reason not to, if the damage bonus that's being provided by the armor is tied to a specific damage type, we want to use the buffs that are used by the surge mods because that's what they were built for. If we want something that's going to apply to all of the weapons that you have equipped, that's something that we will use the sort of same empowered bonus that like Empowering Rift uses. And again, it's sort of about giving people different ways to access those buffs as opposed to like more ways to stack them on top of each other. I think when we do something that's going to stack on top of other existing buffs, it's largely going to be something that is extremely specific, like to a specific weapon archetype, for example, right? Or under really extreme circumstances that are difficult to replicate on a regular basis. And I would say the artifact is another place where you'll see bonuses come in. We didn't, this time around, but like you can certainly imagine that in upcoming seasons you would see, artifact perks because they're temporary and they're supposed to be exciting. They're supposed to be things that really shift the meta in a temporary way, right? So, like, I think that's where more the non-stacking things would come in. To me, my hope is that, like with Path of the Burning Steps and Eternal Warrior using those damage type specific buffs, my hope is that will free up people's leg armor a little bit more than they are right now. Because while certainly it's not as automatic as, I picked up an orb and now I have a tier 3 damage bonus or whatever, you can build up to a larger potential damage bonus. You've got the shortcuts to the highest possible damage bonus. And you might say like, okay, well, whenever we go and do the Nezarec fight in Rito Nightmares, it's like, well, I'm going to put on 3 Arc Surge mods so I can get the most out of my Thunderlord, right? My hope is that we could say like, okay, well, maybe what you actually want to do is, split that up a little bit. So you keep 2 Arc Surge mods or 1 Arc Surge mod on, and you still get a lot out of it, but then you can spare one for scavenger mod or something like that. Just trying to alleviate a little bit of the pressure there is the sort of big goal in my mind.
Man, and those holster mods are quite effective. I definitely feel like that's something that has been kind of underutilized right now in the meta, maybe, and definitely going to be capitalizing on some of that whenever those changes are rolling out.
Yeah, there was actually a bug in the holster mods when they were first introduced into the game where there were certain things that could cause them to deactivate that were unintentional. So like, for example, if I had a holster mod that was going to apply to my heavy weapons and I swapped between my primary and special weapon, even though I didn't touch my heavy weapon at all and it stayed holstered the whole time, that swapping was resetting a timer that was causing the heavy to take longer to reload than necessary. And we fixed that before, is at least before Lightfall. Might have been a few seasons before that. But it was basically the holster mods could be less reliable and less effective than they were intended to be. We also made them cheaper in our bold new build crafting post Lightfall future to try and basically make it so that, like, okay, you're looking at that versus a scavenger. Maybe there's a reason you want to run a holster, but if you've got a reconstruction weapon or you've got auto-loading holster, maybe you don't. Like, it's okay for the same benefit to come from a couple of different avenues, because then it opens up your possibility space. Like, do you want to feel the pressure to have to run the reconstruction weapon, or do you prefer the reconstruction weapon over the holster mod? Like, that's okay for that to be your choice.
Chris, do you have anything to add? I know that we were asking you about that, of course, in your last appearance in regards to weapons, and you had mentioned specifically about truncating damage buffs, simplifying that process. Anything else you want to add?
Yeah, we should really do that. Because as we add more layers of build crafting to the game, each additional multiplier just makes it harder and harder to keep things in check. Like when it was just, you just have a subclass benefit to your punch, that's fine. Okay, now you have 1-2 punch, right? That's a lot of damage, but that's fine. And now you have like Worm God Caress. So like it just, we're at 4 layers or something now, and so it's very, very easy for stuff to go out of band. There are a bunch of ways that we could address this, but it's something we'd definitely like to. It would mean reworking all damage sources in the game, so it's not a small task.
Yeah, this is stuff that was going to come up later, but I'm just going to jump to this one now, and this kind of goes to both of you guys. I know the idea of additive damage stacking rather than multiplicative damage stacking had been thrown around. Like Rodney, are you interested in that? And kind of like, what do you guys think are like the biggest roadblocks of moving towards something that would be a simplification, maybe at the end of the day, but not necessarily just to get to that point, right? Would not be simple by any means.
Yeah, and a lot of it just kind of boils down to what you just said. It's not simple, right? And I don't mean that from a like, this is a hard problem to solve. It's just a problem with many moving parts, right? Because you would need engineering to create the change under the hood, the weapons team specifically, but all of the sandbox design team would then be responsible for a wholesale balance pass across all of our damage sources. And when you have a game like Destiny 2 that is now on, year 7, year 14, I don't even know anymore. What is time? Anyways, a game as long in the tooth as Destiny 2, a lot of content has been built with the current assumptions. We would need to then go in and, undo those assumptions or make different assumptions. That is not to say that it's can't be done or it's not worth doing. It's just not as straightforward of a task. So that's the barrier there. But I think, Chris and I are pretty of like mind about this, and that it would be a great thing for us to do, a great tool to have in our toolbox. The question is, like, what are we willing to leave on the cutting room floor to achieve that, right? It's never about like, do I want to do this work? It's, do I want to do this work or this work or this work or this work, right? There's always more things that we want to do than we can do.
All right, Court.
Yeah, let's head over to our and the Q&A here. I know we're kind of getting beyond time here. We're over an hour now. Rodney, I feel like you've already answered some of my questions related to exotic armors. So really, from the sort of top level here, we've had a mixture of diamonds in the rough and lackluster exotic armors for a while, but we're seeing a lot of upcoming exotic armor changes. So I do have some questions related to that. Do you think, or does the armor team now have sufficient resources to commit to regular, so say seasonal balancing to over and undertuned exotic armor?
We really like doing the balance passes and the revamps. It's helps keep the game fresh and helps keep players who have invested a lot of time and effort into their exotics. Makes their time worth it, right? But that having been said, I don't really have anything that I can announce right now about that. Just because the reality is things change all the time, I was thinking about this earlier while we were talking about something else, but I think often, it's easy to miss how even designers get eyes bigger than their stomachs in some ways, right? How we all want to do more than we actually can, and that has gotten me in trouble with my testers more than a few times. Yeah, like we definitely think it is worth doing.
Yeah, that does actually answer my second point here. So my third point, which is something that I've seen from a lot of community members, is combining exotic armor out of the question. So let's say for Hunter, Raiju's Harness and Blight Ranger. Because from my point of view, I feel like we have too many exotics that have a lot of overlaps with each other within the armor section anyway.
Yeah, I would say it's not off the table, partially because like nothing is really ever off the table. But the challenge with combining exotics is that, like, let's say we take two exotics and we take all of the perks from one and move it over to another one, right? So now that leaves us with an exotic that currently has no perks, right? Which is fine. It's essentially like we're designing a new exotic at that point. But the tricky part about that is, I was talking earlier about how when we do a revamp, we don't want to change the fantasy or the theme of an exotic so much that it becomes unrecognizable to someone that has invested a lot of time in getting the right stat roll or, whatever, right? So the new design then needs to take into account the old fantasy whose perks we have now moved over to that other exotic. So it's not super cut and dry that it's just like, oh, well, yeah, we get to create a whole new exotic here. Great. Ignoring the fact that creating exotics is a non-zero amount of effort, it's, we want to make sure that, like, if I take all the perks from an exotic and give it to somebody else, that when someone who really liked that original exotic loads up, that they're like, oh, okay, this does something, different now, but I still like it because I liked what this exotic represented, right? So that's the real challenge there. Certainly on the table, though.
Cool. I did have a section here related to some specific example of exotic armor, but I don't think we've really got the time to kind of bullet list them, and I don't think that would make much of an interesting show. There were examples of like Young Ahamkara's Spine, Renewal Grasps, Blight Ranger, which you've kind of talked about anyway, keeping that fantasy. So I'm going to pass it back over to Saint if he's got any questions for Chris.
Yeah, kind of a big one I wanted to touch on. This is something we've talked about a little bit here, but, you have weapons and armor, and they're kind of like the left and the right hands of the sandbox, right? And, what is it like trying to stay in touch with each other and, kind of your collective teams here as you're just working in an environment with so many people, so many pieces? You're working, are you guys always on kind of the same release that you're working on, or, kind of like, what does that timeline look there, and how do you guys just try to stay connected?
Yeah, weapons and armor are more or less on the same timeline. We probably start and finish working on a season at different times, but we have like several months worth of playtesting together, and armor and weapons designers are in a lot of the same chats, same meetings, same playtests and everything. So we stay in pretty close touch with each other. And yeah, you'll see like more collaborations between weapons and armor coming in future seasons as well.
That's actually sort of what my job is these days, is to coordinate across not only weapons and armor, but then across the board to the abilities team as well. Like, part of what I do is foster that kind of communication. It also helps, honestly, that like Chris and I play the game together a lot, and like we raid together a lot of Thursdays, or we play on on Fridays we do Grandmasters and things like that. So that helps because even while we're doing a GM or something, we can be chit chatting about like, oh, what if we did X, Y, and Z, right? So even just casual conversations that come up while we're playing the game help out a lot.
Very cool. Good to hear you guys are playing together. I'm sure, like you said, it's like we're literally having these shared experiences of the reality of the sandbox, right, every week.
Our team actually has a Friday morning raid. Like the whole design team plays the game, like the retail game, and has a Friday morning raid that I often pitch in onto.
Oh yeah, another kind of keeping that and just going a step further. We were talking about how old Destiny 2 is at this point, and it's just evolved so much. It's sometimes hard to recognize it, right? If you went back and looked at like some beta gameplay footage. Build crafting specifically has just evolved so much since we originally had combat mods added to the game years ago, and even that was a big change, and those started cross-pollinating and synergizing between systems and stuff like that. And I know it's been mentioned before that these systems were kind of originally designed and anticipated to be in the game for maybe a season or a few seasons rather than indefinitely. And Rodney, I know that you mentioned that this started even as long ago as a couple years ago at this point. When did that idea come into mind that you knew you were going to have to completely convert your basically three branches of mod systems that had kind of power crept up and evolved so much, and then trying to unify that into something that would still allow the power fantasy and kind of Chris, I know this is, again, the way that these two things are so interconnected. What was it like kind of trying to anticipate the effect that this would have on like the weapons sandbox as the armor and mod system changes so dramatically, right?
Yeah, on my side of things, as with so many things, we were looking at like, okay, what's the practical player experience of build crafting with armor mods right now? And taking into account like player feedback and the sort of, I will say the first domino to fall here was the decision to remove armor energy type, right? So instead of having solar and stasis, etc., like that kind of was the first, like once we were like, okay, we're going to do this, what does that mean, right? And that has this sort of cascading effect. And so as soon as there's no more armor energy type, and now all of a sudden you have armor mods that previously could not go in the same armor piece that can now, right? Which means that you have a bunch of mods that have the same effect, but only a slightly different trigger, or the same trigger, but only a slightly different effect, right? Or like, well, now, these 3 different damage bonuses can just sort of stack on top of each other. So that change alone necessitated a really critical look at what are the benefits and mechanics we're getting out of the various mods. And then we could look at things like usage data and say like, oh, okay, well, Taking Charge is far and away the most used combat style mod because it's it's the most straightforward. And hey, you already want to generate orbs, go generate some more. So instead of saying like, okay, well, everyone's going to have to generate or going to have to socket Taking Charge, we're just going to build that right into the mods, right? Once we do that, it's like, okay, well, now we're essentially saying like the orbs are the most important part of the sort of build crafting experience here. What does that mean for elemental wells? Well, it means that now they have, a less important role in the mods, but now they have also overlap with these new subclass, things like stasis shards and what have you. So it's this sort of chain of events, this cascade, right? That kind of goes off of, something as simple as like, hey, I've got, armor energy going away. What does that mean? Right. So yeah, it was certainly challenging. But ultimately between, knowing that we wanted to make this change that players have been requesting for a while and knowing that we had the opportunity to do a big revamp that would make the system more approachable, if not, less complex necessarily, at least the barrier to entry would be lower, right? Like those sort of things combined to sort of become our guiding light. And then, taking that and, following through to the logical conclusion. I'm not going to say it was easy by any stretch. We went through a lot of different iterations, and there were versions of the build crafting, setup that have hit the cutting room floor and will never be spoken of again. Don't you worry. But it was one of those things that like it grew out of, a very simple starting point and expanded to cover all of build crafting. And I will say, like, we had tons of support from every different sandbox team, tons of support from leadership on this. And we were constantly in communication with our community team to talk to them about like, hey, what are the, what's the player reaction going to be to X, right? Because like I might have a pretty good idea, but maybe I should go talk to the person who spends literally every moment of their day listening to the community, right? So, a lot of stuff like that. Take it away, Chris.
As far as the impact of these systems changes to weapons, weapons is kind of isolated from these changes in a lot of ways, in that most of the rework was a reorganization of data, like the whole build crafting system, to make build crafting more player facing. So the effects didn't hit weapons a whole lot, and there were a couple of cases where it did, but mostly it was fairly simple adjustments, I think. It certainly meant that all of the subclass verbs that we've got on exotics and damage type perks are much more valuable now than they were before. So it's like, all gravy.
I think also if we hadn't already moved orb generation off of masterwork weapons and onto armor mods, it would have been a lot more impactful. But because we'd already made that transition, we had disentangled those two systems just a little bit, which made it so that weapons got to avoid a lot of that.
Yeah, 100%. Particularly with stuff like, well, this exotic doesn't have a catalyst, so how am I going to use it in my build crafting now? Like, we don't have to answer that question.
I know there was a lot of conspiracy theory that this was all changed just to make that system work. But to your exact point, the system works because that was changed, not, you know what I mean? Not that I feel like the other way around, and I know that was the whole conversation about kind of the budgets, like in the individual weapons and things like that, right? That you had to allow space for things like origin traits to bloom, which I don't think anybody's going to say that origin traits were not worth the sacrifice of orb generation on your weapon. Like that's just not a conversation,
Yeah, that's a great example too of coordination across teams, because when the concept of origin traits, when the weapons team was starting to put that together, right? Like they were working hand in hand with me and with the armor team. And, basically it was a great example of like, okay, well, the weapons team has this improvement they want to make to their weapon system, but they need our support in the form of, what eventually became the siphon mods, right? And so like, we're able to basically help facilitate this cool thing that they're going to do by making this move to on our side of things. So, there's a lot of interplay between the different teams, even though our systems are often pretty different.
All right. Well, we've got a few minutes left here. Wow, that really flew by. Let's dive into some community questions here. I'll start with the question for you, Chris. When you make a new exotic weapon, do you build them with catalysts in mind, or do you work on those after you have a finished exotic? And can we ever expect catalysts for newer raid exotics like Collective Obligation and Conditional Finality?
Yeah, if we're shipping the catalyst for an exotic alongside the exotic, or we know we're going to ship it later, like a pre-ordered exotic like Quicksilver Storm, we will design the exotic catalyst at the same time, so that it like ties really deeply into the mechanics of the weapon. And in other cases, we will build it after the fact. For the exotic weapons for the new raids, we don't have a reward story for that. We only build catalysts that we have a source for. So until we have one of those, there's no reason why we would go build them. But certainly that would be on the table, and we have ideas for what we could do with most of those.
So another thing we wanted to talk about is kind of, the idea generally it feels like in the game is that activity difficulty increases, the value of my reward increases, right? And one of the questions Sylv had was, do you feel like there are any weapon traits that are too powerful or too weak for their path to acquire them in the game. They mentioned Vanguard, GM weapons. Do you feel like GM weapons are hitting their mark, or do you feel like there are weapons that are maybe too easy to acquire for how good they are, or vice versa in the game currently?
Yeah, certainly we intend that endgame weapons should generally be stronger, like have more potent perk combinations and that sort of thing. And I feel like typically we hit those pretty well, but it's not 100%. So like there are definitely like some weapons that are not strong enough for their source or are too strong, like funnel web is a world drop. Like what were we thinking? There are also like some traits that are clearly too strong or too weak given the source that they come from. Like we might make a raid trait that is just not that desirable. Fortunately, like we're able to go back and update these as we need to, like the advantages of the live game that we talked about before. Definitely interested to hear if there are any in particular, because we have our own lists, but I don't necessarily know what like the PvE crowd has in mind.
The new Wayframe grenade launcher, whose name escapes me at the moment, I felt
World
like
drop.
Yeah, what was that one called?
Harsh language.
Harsh language. Yeah, I felt like that thing was quite strong for a world drop, kind of in the funnel web band there. And I mean, on the opposite side, the example that comes, I don't know if this is the one that Sil was thinking of, but my Midder's Ambition, I remember it just like didn't have a strong like value argument as like I compare it to something like Malicious Birthright, auto-loading holster, lead from gold, great slot weapon, right? Kind of top tier. I don't know. Core and Impetus, you guys have anything you would throw out there?
I'm looking over my vault here.
Any origin trait that's kind of assigned to sort of seasonal, a season or a event. But I think, Chris, you mentioned this last time you were on, where you kind of weigh up those options of, we can't make it too powerful because it would become a little bit of a FOMO type issue. Especially when it's like, we're just coming out of Guardian games, and Class A contender is quite a not too powerful, but it's definitely one of the sort of more kind of potent ones.
I think we got time for one more here. Court, saying, is there one that you really want to get answered before we wrap up here?
I've got one here, actually. It's a kind of combined question. It's related to the Root of Nightmares raid adepts being upgradable to enhance perks now. So, Chris, do you think this run's been successful? You've mentioned before that this system's been quite restrained into Root of Nightmares. So is this maybe something that may get an expansion in the future? This person put Nightfall or Trials gear. And additionally to that, is there any update to multiple crafted perks per slot on a weapon?
Yeah, so we're pretty happy with how the Root of Nightmares raid adepts have played out and been received in game, aside from the initial confusion before they actually shipped. Yeah, they're hitting the mark roughly where we want them to be. We might see making some adjustments, and I'd expect us to give future raid adept weapons basically this exact treatment. I think we'll see other adepts doing something similar as well, like whether it's exactly the same remains to be seen. So the raid ones are kind of a special case because the base weapons are craftable, and those are the only adept weapons for which the base are craftable. That said, we basically intend for every weapon that can't be crafted to be enhanced in the long term, several releases down the line, right? Like everything from world drop weapons to raids to dungeons, whatever. Like you should be able to enhance those. I think that we will want to keep aspects of enhancing unique to adept weapons and maybe to adept raid weapons, like the determinism of a barrel and magazine. It's quite an important value add for those. Yeah, that's our general intent is to roll out enhancement wider across the game. The question about multiple perks, we intend, again, longish term, to be able to enhance multiple perks in a column on weapons that can be enhanced. We don't currently have plans, like specific plans or timeline for allowing you to craft multiple perks, we'll call them. It's just a very different problem space. It's more complex, and we wanted to hit enhancing a bit harder first.
The idea of being able to invest is always good, you know?
All right. Well, we'll have to wrap things up here. We have went over our time, as per usual, when it comes to these podcasts. Chris, Rodney, do you have any questions or follow-ups you want to make before we wrap things up here?
I just want to say thanks for having me. This was a great experience and really great to talk to you.
Anytime.
Yeah, it's always a blast. Thanks for having us on. I'm glad we managed to get weapons and armor on this. It's always a fun interaction.
Our pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. All right. I think that's it for our guests. We're just going to kind of close out our episode here. Again, Chris, Rodney, thanks for coming on, you guys.
Well, that is it for a very special episode. We want to once again thank Bungie's Chris Proctor and Rodney Thompson for joining us, and of course Bungie in general for this great opportunity and a peek into their development process. Thank you once again to our patrons and sponsors for submitting some questions for the Q&A and for keeping the lights running. We do also want to thank our audio engineer, Autodidaktos, for editing this episode and keeping all of us sounding great, especially the 2 extra voices. And finally, thank you to you, the listener. Without this support, this special episode would not have been possible. Once again, we will have an episode transcription and an abridged Reddit breakdown of everything discussed in the show notes. And without further ado, my name is Impetus. You can find me by that name in Discord and in Destiny, and as Impetus always on Twitter. Court, where can our listeners find you?
Yep, you can find me over on Twitter as @CourtProjects. You can find me on Discord as Court. You can also find my infographics and spreadsheet over on the Destiny Massive Breakdowns website, along with other applications and spreadsheets to enhance your Destiny experience. Saint, where can we find you?
My name is Saint Kabir. You can find me by Saint_Kabir on Twitter and in the game and in the Massive Breakdowns Discord. If you didn't know that this interview episode was coming up, be sure to go follow Massive Breakdowns on Discord. Stay in touch for all the upcoming news on the various shows, schedule changes, anything like that. Thank you, everybody, for your support. Thank you for your time. And thanks for listening to another episode of PvE.